In the previous video, we learned about the four domains of power identified by sociologist Patricia Hill-Collins. It's important to have a solid understanding of these domains in order to see how power operates at many different levels and in many different ways to oppress people. However, this kind of knowledge can also overwhelm us with feelings of helplessness. How can we ever hope to change the world when you have entrenched systems of power such as these? Collins, however, takes care to point out that understanding these domains of power also serves to highlight important paths to empowerment. In other words, each of these domains of power can also be used as a site of individual and group empowerment in order to resist and challenge the system of oppression. So now we're going to examine how these domains also represent pathways to empowerment. Starting with the structural domain, one recognizes that an important path to empowerment involves working to transform all the social institutions that foster the many forms of exclusion. Clearly, given the scope of these social institutions and the fact that they are interlocking with one another, changes of this magnitude won't happen overnight. Remember that society and social organizations are inherently conservative in nature. This means that social institutions are highly resistant to change. As a result, when looking at the history of challenging such institutions, you'll find that social change has most often been gradual and reformist, though often punctuated by periods of system-wide upheaval. Reform work within the structural domain typically means targeting the legal system, as well as social policy aimed at structural transformation. For example, connecting this back to the topic of the concentration of wealth, it is within our power to work toward policy changes regarding things like income and inheritance tax policies, as well as minimum wage policies. While often frustrating in terms of how slowly change occurs when targeting the structural domain, it's important to remember that legal strategies have yielded and are likely to continue to yield results. Moreover, these legal changes do make a profound impact, and so are well worth the time and effort. Turning to the disciplinary domain, the overarching strategy of empowerment involves resistance from inside the bureaucratic system. At the same time, organizations may employ surveillance of oppressed groups within their ranks. The oppressed have the capacity to keep the organization itself under surveillance. As the oppressed gain access into positions of authority, they may use bureaucratic resources toward humanistic ends, making sure that existing rules will be administered fairly, and if necessary, changing existing policies. So, once oppressed groups have a foothold within organizations, they can make a difference in how the organization operates. So, for example, before it was legal for gay and lesbian couples to marry, I worked with a handful of other faculty and staff to pressure Augsburg to provide domestic partner benefits. That way, unmarried partners would be treated the same way as a spouse here at Augsburg. The president at the time faced a lot of pushback, but he held his ground and the policy change remained in effect. More recently, I completed the Augsburg Curricular and Inclusion Study, which is available on the Academic Affairs website if you're interested in reviewing it. The goal was to essentially surveil Augsburg in terms of how well or poorly it is doing in its efforts to be more inclusive within the curriculum, the classroom, and student life. So this study called attention to Augsburg's strengths and weaknesses in this regard, all from the perspective of students. Now let's turn to the hegemonic domain. Remember that this domain is all about how the dominant culture shapes our consciousness through the manipulation of ideas, images, symbols, and so on. This means that freeing our minds becomes an important area of empowerment and resistance. It's important to remember that consciousness is not a fixed entity. Instead, it's continuously evolving and negotiated. In other words, consciousness is dynamic, and such dynamism is vital to individual and group agency. And so the goal here is to craft counter-hegemonic knowledge that emphasizes the power of self-definition and fosters a changed consciousness. Notice how this is very similar to Marx's conception of class consciousness, which serves to strip away the ideologies that are used to mask exploitation. This can take place in a host of different social environments, including families, community settings, schools, religious institutions, and within both social and mass media. Regardless of the setting, it requires reclaiming these spaces for thinking and doing what runs counter to the dominant hegemonic storyline. Overall, empowerment within the hegemonic domain is twofold. On the one hand, empowerment is reactive. Reactive empowerment refers to gaining the critical consciousness to tear down hegemonic ideologies. For example, it is possible to challenge historical narratives or popular culture for being too white, too straight, too male-oriented, and so on. Then there's proactive empowerment, which involves developing new knowledge that provides alternatives to the dominant images regarding how things are supposed to be. This will often involve telling stories that shift away from the white, straight, male, cis, Christian-centered narrative that dominates our popular culture as well as our history. Finally, there is empowerment within the interpersonal domain. Collins tells us that because the interpersonal domain stresses the everyday interactions we have with others, resistance strategies within this domain will be as varied as there are individuals. As she observes, there are, quote, myriad ways in which ordinary individuals from all walks of life work for social justice in small yet highly significant ways. Overall, empowerment and resistance within this domain requires creatively responding to the immediate demands of interacting with others, including learning to recognize, expose, and ultimately challenge even the small ways in which domination happens, whether it's being directed at ourselves or those around us. This also requires engaging in a self-reflective process in order to recognize how we subordinate others based on some other dimension of the matrix of oppression. Then it's incumbent upon us to challenge ourselves and our own prejudices. As you might imagine, this ties back to the topic of identity development, with the goal being to develop an identity that is actively anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, and so on. Overall, it's important to keep in mind that the dialectical relationship between oppression and activism is highly complex. Collins argues that no form of oppression is more fundamental than any other because they ultimately overlap, interrelate with, and reinforce one another within the matrix. This also means that varied forms of activism are all important, no matter how great or small. Taking action presents both opportunities and constraints. For example, simply gaining access to settings from which those like you have been excluded in the past provides new opportunities for fostering social justice. Using the insights gained from one's outsider within status can be a stimulus to creativity that can help all those in your same situation, not to mention changing that social setting for the better. However, we also have to recognize that being a permanent outsider within will never lead to power because the category, by definition, requires marginality. Therefore, we cannot afford to allow ourselves to ensconce this outsider within identity within ourselves. In other words, Collins tells us that we can't afford to continue thinking of ourselves as a victim. If we do, we are contributing to our own oppression. Instead, she argues that we have to focus on our own empowerment, and we become empowered when we understand and use the unique ways of knowing we all develop based upon our standpoint within the matrix of oppression to foster our own humanity. Toward the end of her book, Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins argues that engaging the sociological imagination is itself empowering, and here we come full circle to the theme of our very first day of class. As she points out, the sociological imagination, quote, identifies its task and its promise as a way of knowing that enables individuals to grasp the relations between history and biography within society. Using one's point of view, what you'll recall sociologist Dorothy Smith calls standpoint epistemology, to engage the sociological imagination can empower the individual. End quote. Recall from our coverage of the sociological imagination the tension that exists between human agency on the one hand and societal constraint on the other. While much of our social circumstances were determined for us by our social and historical context, that does not mean we are powerless in the face of history. Recognizing the interplay between oppression and activism exposes how the matrix of domination and the domains of power are fundamentally responsive to human agency. In other words, as Collin tells us, quote, "There is always a choice and power to act, no matter how bleak the situation may appear to be. Viewing the world as one in the making raises the issue of individual responsibility for bringing about change. It also shows that while individual empowerment is key, only collective action can effectively generate the lasting institutional transformation required for social justice." End quote.